Tonight we delved to understand what happens when I do the commandment. What happens when there's intention? Is it the same? Yes. Is it different? Absolutely. So we are in chapter 38. The first part of 38 was continuing 35, 36, and 37, and speaking about the significance of action. In this case, action meant prayer, because the movement of the lips, as we move our lips, that is considered by our sages a form of action. And if we pray with our lips and not with our intention, it still basically is prayer. But if we have intention and we don't move our lips, it's not. So that was solidifying this concept of action as most significant. But we're saying we also need a lot of intention. We need our mind. And as we're going to discuss, we need our hearts involved, which we spoke about last week. And we had a lot of great tips and great personal input. So now let's look inside. So we are in chapter 38, and we're going to go to 2, 4, 6, 8 lines from the top after the 2 dots. But nevertheless, despite how enormously significant action is, doing what God is asking you to do, Amru, they said, our sages said, Tefillah, prayer, or Sha'ar bracha, or any other blessing, lo kavana, without intention, without having an intention of your mind, or ideally of your heart, hengeguf below neshama, is like a body without a soul. And we said, what does that mean? What do our sages mean by saying prayer without intention is a body without a soul? And we said, well, that sounds like saying if you pray without intention, it's a dead body, it's a corpse. But that can't be, because we just discussed, and the law is that most of the time, if you're praying without intention, it still counts as prayer. It's still prayer. Not the best, but most of the time it still counts. So it's not a dead body. It's a living body, maybe minimal life, but it's still alive. It's still counting. What did our sages mean by saying prayer without intention is a body without a soul? So what we have here is parable. The parable here is the body without the soul. We know what it represents, prayer without intention, but all of that is really representing something else. So let's unpack this. We discussed this last week, but let's unpack this very, very, very clearly. So we have here, we could say this versus this in the parable, in the mashal, in the storyline. What's our storyline? Well, our sages speak about a body without a soul. So the contrast point to that would be a body with a soul. So we have 2 dimensions, 2 aspects, a body with a soul, a body without a soul. Now we would say, well, a body with a soul means you're alive. You got a soul in that body. And a body without a soul means dead. What's a body without a soul? But we know that can't be what it means. That can't be the storyline we're talking about. We understand the parable, and then we can understand what the parable is representing. But what does this parable mean? Like, let's decode the parable. A body with a soul, a body without a soul. The Alter Rebbe is decoding the parable and saying, we're not talking about a body with a soul and a body without a soul, because a body without a soul is a dead body, and that's not what prayer without intention is. What we're talking about is the spiritual energy of the soul versus the spiritual energy of the body. So again, in our parable, if I had a blackboard, if you could read my handwriting, if I could write this for you, this is how I would lay it out. Body with a soul, body without a soul. Body with a soul decoded means the spiritual energy of the soul. Body without a soul doesn't mean a dead body. Body without a soul, decoded, again, we're decoding the parable. Body without a soul means the spiritual energy of the body. So again, the storyline, like the sages are saying, is you got a body with a soul and a body without a soul. What they mean is we're contrasting the spiritual energy of the soul to the spiritual energy of the body. So to understand that, as the Alter Rebbe is going to explain, we have to understand that everything has soul. We think of soul like the godly soul of a Jew. And that, of course, is soul. But actually, the secret is everything has soul. This piece of paper has, which you can't see now, This piece of paper has soul. This pen has soul. Everything has soul. Soul means it's spiritual energy. A blade of grass has soul. A clod of earth has soul. Everything has soul. Everything exists. If it exists, it has soul. It has a spiritual spark, an angel, a life that gives it existence. That's the soul of the pen or of the body or of any other item in our world. Now, we actually know in the times of the redemption, in the times of Mashiach, we're told the energy of the body will be greater than the energy of the soul. And the spirituality of the body will feed and nurture the spirituality of the soul. But now, in the world as we have it now, we view the spirituality of the body as far less than the spirituality of the soul. Meaning everything has soul, but soul is as per your need. As the Rebbe will explain, we think of the stratas of our physical world as inanimate, vegetation, animal, man. Inanimate has soul. That clog of earth has soul. That rose bush has soul. That turtle has soul. That human has soul. A human body has soul. They all have soul. They all have a godly energy that's their life. But the soul is different on each level. And of course, within each level and each item. Because how much energy does God give as per your needs, as per what you're going to use? We don't waste. It wouldn't be healthy to give you more energy than you could use. You wouldn't want to pull into a hair dryer the energy of your central air conditioning unit. That wouldn't be healthy. That would be detrimental. That would burn out the hair dryer. So soul is as per the capacity of that item, but everything has soul. So again, the storyline, it's not a king and a prince. The storyline is a body with soul versus a body without a soul, which our sages mean the spirituality of soul versus the spirituality of body. They both have spirituality. They both have soul. But obviously the soul, spiritual energy of a Jew, a Jewish soul, a piece of God himself, far blows away the spiritual energy of the body of a Jew, which is also quite intense, but totally different reality. That was all the parable, the storyline, the mush. What's it representing? As we say, what's the nimshal? What is this to help us understand? So our sages are using this to understand the difference between praying with intention and praying without intention. If you pray and you're mindful, you're focused, your mind is there, your heart is there, your prayer is like the spirituality of soul. If you pray, you say all the words, you move your lips, you could even be looking inside and you could even be hearing your voice, but your mind and your heart are checked out. You prayed. Besides the first blessing of Shemona Esrei and the first line of the Shema prayer, you prayed. But the spirituality is much smaller. It's like comparatively the spirituality of body. So my prayers with intention, like the spirituality of soul. My prayers, unfortunately, like sometimes happens, without intention, like the spirituality of body. Now, that's the storyline, body with soul, body without soul, decoded, spirituality of soul, spirituality of body, representing prayer with intention, prayer without intention. Now, when we say prayer with intention, prayer without intention, that's representing the whole field of our service of God. So prayer with intention represents any service of God with intention. And prayer without intention represents any service of God without intention. So again, I know I'm repeating this a lot, but I want to make it very clear without my blackboard. I'm just drilling it into our brains, make it very clear the structure here. Body with soul means the spirituality of soul, represents praying with intention, actually represents always, whenever you serve God, whenever you do a commandment with intention, with a focused mind, with an engaged heart. Body without soul means a far lesser level of spirituality, the spirituality of the body, representing prayer without intention, which symbolizes any service of God, that you're doing the service, but your mind and your heart are not in. So let's read this inside. Hopefully it is supremely clear, because of course this is getting to rather deep ideas. I want to make sure it's very, very clear. Perush, meaning to say, just like all of the creations of this world, every creation of this world has two components, body and soul. Doesn't just mean a human, doesn't just mean a Jew. It means a rock. It means a computer. It means a pen. It means a shoe. Anything of this world has the two elements of body and soul. Shem nefesh kol chai, ruach kol basar, ish, meaning the soul, the spirit of all life, the spirit of the flesh, of all man. V'nishmas kol asher ruach chaim bapa, the soul of all that has breath in their nostrils. Not only of man, we call balei chayim, of all animals. And as we're saying, not even of animals, of vegetation, and not even vegetation, of inanimate. All have body, all have soul. God is giving all of them life, existence, which is why they all have soul. That's that component of God that's constantly vivifying them. It's not like God created 5,700 some years ago or yesterday. It's always a constant act of creation, which is why every aspect in creation needs soul. It needs that which is vivifying it constantly. But with the light, with the vitality that God is giving via the soul to every created being. Because even our body, which is viewed as corporeal, coarse, not just physical, but a level of physicality that obstructs God. Not only our bodies, animals, not only animals, plants, not only plants, inanimate, stones, earth, literal inanimate. We don't see life. Yesh bo or v'chayis mimenu yisbarach. It's got God in it. It's got God's life. It's got God's vitality. Well, why does a stone need vitality? So it should exist as a stone. Because if we don't have God's vitality in it, it will cease to exist. And therefore, all of creation, like this piece of paper, like this pen, like things, life, what's the life? It grows, it lives, it dies, it speaks, it exists. For this to exist, it has a body. We can describe the body, its length, its cylinder's shape, its colors, its components, the materials it's made from. We can describe the body. That's all body. And it has soul. How much soul does a pen have? Not much. But it has to have soul to be. But nevertheless, even though we're talking about the soul of this pen, and it's the truth, and we're not joking, and the pen has soul, but we cannot compare, obviously, in erech v'dinyon klal. There is no comparison at all. Nothing. If we're looking at the soul, the light, the vitality, the life, the flow from God, vivifying body, the God in terms of the contrast point, how much life and vitality and light of God is infusing our soul. Shehi nefesh kol chai, soul of all life. Okay, wait, let me stop here just to make sure this is clear, because then we're going to go on to a new point. So what the Rebbe was saying, and I do hope it was clear, because we really chewed it over very well before, which I did deliberately, because otherwise this could be very Kabbalistically confusing. Everything has body. Everything has soul. As per the development of body, that's going to be the development of soul. Inanimate, vegetation, animal, man. Soul, more soul, more soul, more soul. Why? Well, because inanimate, we don't even see life, though it exists and therefore needs soul. In vegetation, there's life. Plants grow, plants shrivel, wither, die. According to the Talmud and modern science, plants have language, they have a type of communication. So there's a lot more going on in the life of a plant than a rock, which means it needs a lot more soul. But you can't compare that to an animal, to the most simple gnat, or to a very, very developed monkey or tiger, or lion, bear, elephant, feline species. Obviously, within each species, there's a different amount of body, and therefore there's a different amount of soul, but it's far more going on than in a plant. And that's nothing compared to man. And body of man is nothing compared to soul of Jew. Every level, we got body, we've got soul. But even the highest body, the body of a Jew, no way can we compare the soul of the body of the Jew to the soul of the Jew. And that's like the intention flooding our commandments versus doing it without intention. Yet, at the same time, we can say, and we can say, is this really so different? Like it is, but like it isn't. In a sense, roughly, similarly, is the light infusing everything of this world, all body, all soul. Let me explain before we read. Our world, which is the only physical reality there is. When I say our world, I don't mean planet Earth. I mean the whole physical dimension of God's energy, which is called Kabbalistically the physical dimension of the worlds of Asiya, of God's action. So everything we know of this whole Milky Way galaxy system, that's all our world. Our world is a very constricted level of God energy. It has to be because it's physical. But of course, it is God's energy, because if it wasn't God's energy, it wouldn't be. So there needs to be a lot of constrictions to get God into this world. But God has to be in this world because otherwise nothing would be. So we need God in this world because the only building block is God. But we need God very constricted because we want a very physical world that doesn't necessarily have to acknowledge him. That's our challenge, to acknowledge him. If there was no challenge, there'd be no point. God has to be constricted enough that it's a challenge, that it's can we, how do we? We need to push and focus and work to acknowledge and see God in this world. But at the same time, we need God in this world, otherwise the world wouldn't be. So therefore, the God energy has to be very, very constricting. And we're talking about constricting God energy. There's a number of techniques God uses. He covers over his energy. He's like wrapping it in layers and layers and layers. He's also like turning it inward, turning it inward, turning it inward, and many other tools that we call constriction, symptom. We have terms for them: hester panim, concealment of the inner energy of God. All of these terms meaning God energy is getting smaller and more constricted and more covered over and more inverted, small and small and small enough that from this is going to come physical, from this is going to come a world that doesn't necessarily recognize God. To enable that to be, everything that enters this world has to go through a conveyor belt. The conveyor belt is called klipas noiga. That term that, of course, we've used many, many, many times in this class, which means a level of concealment where the God energy could be perceived, but also is covered over. That's what we call klipas noiga. It's a shell, it's a husk, but yet there's a noiga. There's a glimmer of light shining through. That film of klipas noiga wraps around this entire world. So any energy that enters this world, any God power that enters this world has to go through that conveyor belt, has to go through that film of klipas noiga, which changes it, which conceals it, which constricts it, which means the energy in this world is sort of basically the same. We were saying, well, there's the soul of a rock, there's the soul of a flower, there's the soul of an animal, there's the soul of the body of man, there's soul of man. And that's a lot of hierarchy, which it is. At the same time, it's all been through the same conveyor belt. It's all been through that film, that constriction of klipas noiga. So on one hand, it's all very similar. On the other hand, it's very different. And that's the question. Well, how? What's the difference? If it's all so similar, because it all went through that klipas noiga constriction. Let's read that inside, and then we can get to see to that point. Now, even though in both of them, energy of the body, energy of the soul, it's the same light, basically, because it all went through that same constriction of klipas noiga. Bibchinas hester panim, when we're talking about the concealment, the constriction of the inner dimension of God's vitality, the levushim, there's many, many garments, barriers that the light becomes more and more obscured. Shavim, that are equal. Any energy in this world has to have that concealment of the inner dimension. Any energy that comes to this world has to have many, many layers to obscure the light that it's not so perceivable. That the light that's within those garments is really concealed, is really covered over, is really engarbed, because we want a physical world where with work we see God. We don't want it to be impossible, then what would be the point? But as we have it now until the complete redemption, it's not obviously no question there, because God wants us to choose him. God wants us to work. God wants us to put him first over the overwhelming physicality of this world. So it's a very precise, you can see me enough if you're looking, but if you choose to ignore me, you can convince yourself I'm not there. Very precise. And that requires a lot of work to have such constriction on God energy, to have just touch me if you can, look and see me. But if you want to turn your back, the choice is yours. And therefore, in a sense, all the God energy in this world went through the similar constrictions, very similar. It's pretty much the same thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped words. Because both of them, meaning energy of body, energy of soul, are from this physical world. That generally speaking is sort of the same type of constriction they both had to go through. Everything has to go through to get into our physical world. We're talking about the constriction of the inner dimension, the descent through all the levels, the progression of the world, level upon level, through many myriads of intense constrictions. Could you imagine taking God matter and making a pen? Can you imagine taking God matter and making evil? Every evil of this world is God matter. Every pen and rock, it's God matter. So how much constriction that God matter has to go through to become these items of this world? God had to be so constricted because, again, he has to fit in that conveyor belt of klipas noiga. He has to fit through that mechanism that anything getting into this world has to go through, which is enormous constriction. Imagine the constriction. That's what's necessary to be able to vivify this very corporeal world. Dehainu, meaning to say, what do I mean here by we have to go through this conveyor belt of klipas noiga? Well, that is what's vivifying, called devarim hamutarim v'hatahayrim shebolam hazeh. Everything permissible, everything pure, everything that God allows in this world. Umimena val yada, and then taking it the next level, even lower, through her, mushban dvarim hatamayim. We go to the next level to vivify things that are forbidden, things that are impure. Because klipas noiga is this intermediary energy, as we've learned about. So what we're saying here, now again, this could seem like a very long segue that you're like, what does this have to do with intention, non-intention? The Rebbe is giving a lot of pretty Kabbalistic background, but he's giving it because for you to really understand the concept, You need to understand how the energy of this world, no matter how higher or lower it is, in a sense, is so similar. Like the energy we draw down with the commandment and the energy we draw down with intention is similar. It's actually the same energy, but it's so different. Like the energy of a body and the energy of a soul, but it's so similar. So that's why we're really explaining the Kabbalah of the storyline, the background understanding, to then understand from there the dynamics of the commandment with or without infusing it with intent. So again, I'm going to explain this background idea, which is all background, but needed background to understand the point the Rebbe is making. We first said there's layers and layers of soul, higher and higher, depending on what it is vivifying in the developmental spectrum, right? Is it a rock? Is it a bush? Is it a snail? Is it a dog? Is it an elephant? Is it a body of a human being? Higher, higher, higher developmentally, more and more and more soul. And then all of that compared to the soul of a totally cosmic jump. So many layers. At the same time, the Rebbe is saying, but all that energy had to go through the barriers to get into this world. So they're not so different. They are so different, and they're not so different. Why am I saying they're not so different? Because the Rebbe was explaining to take God energy and bring it into this world, you need a lot of constriction on that God energy. In the end of the day, it's going to be a rock, or it's going to be a turtle, it's going to be an elephant, or it's going to be a body, or even it's going to be soul. It still has to get into this world. And you need a tremendous constriction on any God energy to get into this world. And when you've constricted it enough, and it's finally like at the threshold of this world, it has to get through this thing called klipas noiga, this barrier thing called klipas noiga. Because everything from this physical world that's permissible is coming through that barrier called klipas noiga. So all God energy has to go through that barrier called klipas noiga. And then the Rebbe said, once it gets into this world through this klipas noiga, it might have a lot more constrictions on it. Because maybe this God energy is vivifying evil, is vivifying what God does not allow. And if it's vivifying evil, we need a lot more constrictions on it to go even lower, that not only has that conveyor belt of klipas noiga, it has another whole overlay called klipas tameus, that it's vivifying an item, an energy, a force that you can't perceive, access, reveal God at all. But what's inside that item, that evil? God. That's the only building block there is. So what do we take from this whole concept? What we're taking from this concept is all the items, however high developmentally they are or low, however spiritual they are or not, the light, in a sense, is the same energy, because it all had to get into this world. But at the same time, it's far different, the light of a body and the light of a soul. It's far different, the light of a human body and the light of a stone. Somehow, all of that plays into serving God with intention, serving God without intention, because that's the exact same dynamics. I have the commandments, I have the intention. And you know what? They're both basically drawing down the same energy. The energy is called will of God, Ratzon ha'elyon, God's supernal will. The commandment draws down God's supernal will. The intention draws down God's supernal will. So basically, again, we're speaking sort of in broad terms, but broadly speaking, it's like the same energy. So if it's the same energy, why are we saying it's so different? If it's the same energy, basically, that's vivifying a body or vivifying a soul, why are we thinking it's so different? On one hand, it's the same. On one hand, it's very different. What's the difference? How expansive, how felt, how much that energy can shine. If you could envision, simple parable, sunlight. Sunlight is sunlight is sunlight. We're not changing the sun. We're about 90 million miles away and we're not changing the sun. But even though the sun is so powerful, Depending on the drapery system I have in my home, that's how much sunlight's going to penetrate. And if it's very thick drapes, not much sun can get in. Well, what if the drapes are thinner? What if there are fewer of them? Or what if there are more of them? What if they're partially opened? What if there's holes in them? All different options here for how much that sunlight can penetrate and illuminate the room. And the more open it is, the more flimsy, thin, sheer is the draperies, the more that sunlight can wash that room. So you do a commandment, you draw down God's will. You do the commandment with intention, you draw down through the intention another layer of the same thing, right? God's will. But this layer, drawn down with your mind and your heart, with your focus on God, with your feeling for God, with your intent for God, this is like the same sunlight, but now the draperies are wide open. The light is pouring through your home. You did the commandment, the sunlight's coming in as much as the drapery allows it. So it's light, but obscured. Light, but maybe not felt so much, maybe not illuminating so much. Now I'm adding the overlay of intention. It's like, wow. Same sunlight, but now we can see it. Now we open the drapes. Now we're putting up only shears. Now the light's flooding us. That's what intention creates inside of us with each and every commandment. On the bottom line of the page, nevertheless, ha'ara, this radiance, this glow, this shine, drawing down this energy, asher havaya meir umechaya, that God is vivifying, that God is illuminating, through this garment, through the barriers, through the layers, through the obstructions, is not the same. Yes, there's a general constriction everything has to go through, but then we can differentiate. How much is that light constricted once it had enough constriction to get into our world? How much can that light shine? How much can that light be expressive? Because in the physical body, in the literal inanimate, right? That's the lowest we're going. Stones, dirt. The constriction is really intense. Can't compare it to anything else. The vitality is so minimized. How do we see that it's such a minimal life? Because inanimate can't grow. It has no life properties. We don't see it growing. We don't see it withering. We wouldn't call it alive. We wouldn't call it dead. We could just call it existing. So that shows that there's very little expression of God energy in it because it's very minimally seeming to have life. Now, if we contrast that with vegetation, well, it's not as constricted because we see life, growth. We don't see movement. We don't necessarily see intelligence, but we see some type of life, far more than a stone, which means that same godliness that's in the stone is in the plant, but it's more expressed. It's able to be more expressive. But derech klal, so generally speaking, nechalakos la'arba madregos, our world, as we said, has these 4 stratas, subdivides into these 4 levels. Domem, Someya, Chai, Medaber. Inanimate, vegetation, animal, man. Which 4 is not random. We couldn't think of a more of a breakdown. We could, but we can't. Because our world is structured on God's holy name of 4 energies, of 4 levels, 4 layers, 4 letters. And therefore, in our world, we have these 4 strata. Well, why? Why are the 4 letters of God's name creating 4 stratas in our physical world? Because God's name is the energy of our physical world. So if in God's name we have these 4 layers, as expressed by these 4 letters, in our physical world, we're going to have 4 stratas, because that's its source. That's where it's coming from. And now what we're going to do is make, like, from the 4, 2. And what the Rebbe is doing here, we started off with a parable of the sages, a body with a soul, a body without a soul, that we unpacked extensively at the beginning of this class. Now we're morphing into another parable, the 4 stratas: inanimate, vegetation, animal, man. For us, that parable is easier to understand. We understand inanimate. We think of stones. We understand vegetation. We think of plants. We understand what animals are. We understand what man is. So it's much easier for us to have a grip on that parable, on that storyline, than envisioning the vitality of a body versus the vitality of a soul. Once we start thinking about the vitality of a body, we can get confused. What is the vitality of the body? That's its soul. No. It's its soul, not soul. It's the soul of the body. So already that more Kabbalistic concept could be hard for us to understand. Well, the parable we're supposed to understand, because from the parable we're supposed to understand what the parable represents. So we started off with the sages parable, which has a lot of advantage, has many expressing the dynamics of it's all the same, but it's all different very clearly. And now we're morphing into this other metaphor that the Rebbe is developing of the 4 stratas: inanimate, vegetation, animal, and man, because that's something we really can get. And we want to really get the parable to really get what the parable represents. So the Rebbe is saying now that we can sort of group those 4 levels: inanimate, vegetation, and then animal, man. And now we're going to see what those represent, because again, on one hand, we discuss them to understand the concept. And now we're using that as a springboard, as a metaphor, as a parable, for what we want to now say. Just as we cannot compare the vitality, the energy, the life, the godliness in inanimate and vegetation, in contrast to the vitality in animal or man, even though, as we explained at length, well, it's the same light. It all has to go through the conveyor of klipas naiga. It all has to go through basically the same constriction to get into this world. It all has to go through the same concealment of its inner nature. It all has lots of garments, and it all has that same garment, the garment of klipas naiga, that's constricting all of them equally. So on one hand, inanimate, vegetation, animal, man has the same light in it, but you can't compare the light and the energy and the ability in inanimate, vegetation, animal, and man. There's no comparison. Now let's talk about what we really want to talk about here. Between the drawing down of the infinite light of God, his inner will, without any concealments, without any barriers at all. That's engarbed in doing those action mitzvahs. And higher level, the energy of those commandments of speech, which is spiritually higher, more intimate than action. Movement of lips, but without intention. That we could view also like an action. If we contrast all that to the intention when we're doing these action commandments, that man is thinking, I'm doing this to be one with God. I'm doing this to fuse with God. How am I fusing with God? Because this is his will and I'm doing it. The will of God is that I should make this blessing. I'm making the blessing so God and I are one. The will of God is that I should eat this food and not that food. So I'm eating this food and not that food, so God and I should be one. That's an intention. And that's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. Because I want to be one with God, to cling to God. Adekim Ritzona, through fulfilling his will. Shehu Ritzonach, that he and his will are one. And so too, in all blessings and prayers, in all of them, because when you have that, you want to cling, you want to be one, you want your mind and heart and soul to be one with God. Let me explain a bit what I just said here. We covered a lot today. I know I spoke extensively. Hopefully everybody was absorbing well because no one had any questions. But let me explain this final point. We discussed inanimate vegetation, animal, and man. We discussed it initially as a way of understanding the concept that, yeah, they all have soul, and rocks have soul, and rose bushes have soul. And at the same time, they have to have soul because they have to exist. But yeah, there's obviously a different soul that a stone needs than an elephant needs. A different soul than a human body, different soul than a godly soul needs. So we use that concept of inanimate vegetation, animal, and man to develop this broad understanding of everything has soul, and that's a generic term we're using for it all, but it's all different because obviously the more developmental functionality you have, the more powers you have, the more abilities you have, the more soul you have. Now that we really understand that concept, we're using it as a metaphor. Everything we understood now is a metaphor for our service of God. And for the metaphor's sake, in a sense, we could lump together inanimate vegetation, animal, man. Though, of course, there's a reason why there's 4 and not 2. We're more specific, but it's this category and that category. What does this all represent? So the Rebbe said, inanimate represents commandments of action without intention, not infused with intention. Just the commandment of action itself. Vegetation represents commandments of speech and thought, not with intention, just the commandments of speech and thought itself. And animal and man represents 2 levels of intention, which we didn't say yet, and we're going to say towards the end of the chapter. Animal represents the natural feeling for God we have coming from our godly soul. And man has intellect. That's what distinguishes man from everything else. No artificial intelligence here, the real deal. The intellect of man, that's like using your mind to create an emotional relationship with God, the highest we can go. So we have inanimate and vegetation, serving God, separate from intention, not the energy of intention, just the energy of the service. Animal and man, the energy drawn down by intention. Inanimate was specifically the lowest from this level of spiritual awareness, literally action commandments, putting the coin in the charity box. And vegetation, which is higher and more developed, more inner developed commandments, commandments of speech, commandments of thought, that are more of an investment of self, but still not necessarily have intention. Intention, which we were saying was intellectually, most basic intention. I'm doing this because I want a relationship with you. I'm doing this to be one with you. I'm doing this to cling and fuse with you. And even more, the emotional investment, which is represented by animal and man, both levels of intention, but animal, the more animal, innate, intuitive, instinctive, Jewish heart that relates and wants God. And man, like intellect, using your mind to create that emotional connection. Now, all 4 of these, again, going back to our original metaphor concept, storyline, that is true, they all have energy. And in a sense, it's all the same energy. It's all energy that went through the conveyor belt of Klipas Naiga. But there's greater and greater expansiveness to that energy. So too, serving God with the action, like inanimate, with commandments of speech and thought, like the vegetation. They have soul. They have will of God. But it's much more constricted. It's harder for us to feel and be affected by it. When we go to the higher stratas, animal and man, metaphorically representing serving God with its natural love and fear, or man serving God with intellectually developed love and fear, then that same light's coming. That's an inanimate and vegetation, the will of God. But now it's flooding me. Now it's expansive. Now I'm experiencing it. I'm feeling it. My soul is flooded with it. And therefore, I'm gaining so much more from the experience. And therefore, I feel changed. I feel different. I know it's late and I spoke a lot, but anyone have experienced something like this when they did something for God and they like felt it? It wasn't just like, okay, God said to do it, so I did it. God said to do it, and I even saw he responded and good things happened in my life. But literally the action itself, as you were doing it with focus, you like felt something. You felt some God energy in you. Anyone merited to have such experience like that they remember?
Hi, it's Lisa. Definitely, when I am writing a check as a gift for charity, the feeling that I have inside of me is like nothing else. It's just this beautiful, wonderful feeling that makes me wish that I was uber wealthy so that I could just do it over and over and over again to bring whatever's needed to the charity, but also to be able to live in a state of feeling like that. It is just like nothing else. So I definitely get what you're talking about in this specific regard, and probably others if I thought about it long enough.
Beautiful. I'm so glad you've had that experience. Sounds like it many times. Beautiful. Anyone else had times when they like feel it? They're not just serving God, which is not a just, which is very important, but with their service, they feel like the light is not just inside them in a constricted way. It's experienced. Well, I think like Lisa said, we all probably have, and each one of us is in something different. Maybe we share similars and maybe it's very different. I'm sure we've all had sometimes that experience where you feel something. Not just you're doing what God wants and you're very happy that you're doing what God wants, but you feel something. You're feeling some of this energy, because when the intention is there, it's not just that the energy is coming down, you're experiencing it. Your soul is flooded with that light. And that's completely different power than when the energy is coming down, but there's a lot of curtains. So you can't feel the energy you're drawing down. So we will stop at this point. We did a tremendous amount. Hopefully it was clear, because we definitely did a lot of deep ideas. And so